I don't actually expect them to meet every single category full on or anything like that. I
Mm-hmm.
suspect it's probably going to be reasonably moderate in a lot of these. So we'll see. We are examining the bite model. We're examining Seventh day Adventists on the bite model. And I have a previous Seventh day Adventist here and a current Seventh day Adventist. Go ahead and introduce yourselves. Why don't we start with Andrea and Time Swift? How long were you in the religion? Are you still in it or?
No, I'm not. I'm not still in it. I was basically born into the religion. Both my parents are Adventists. My grandparents on both sides are Adventists. And I was baptized at 15. I withdrew my membership at either 22 or 23. I can't remember exactly when I did that. Ironically, my deconversion process started at an Adventist college.
Adventist College. I didn't know that they had those. Very interesting. Uh,
Yeah, there's quite a few. Andrews University, Loma Linda
hmm.
University, Walla Walla University, Southern Adventist University. I know there are more, but those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking to me about this. And we have the Jolly Duck here. Are you currently Seventh Day Adventist? Are you previously? What's your affiliation with it?
I'm currently a Seventh day Adventist. I was born into it. My dad was born Seventh day Adventist, but my mom converted from Catholicism to Adventism.
Okay.
A lot of my family, though, are from different denominations, like Pentecostals,
Mm.
uh, weirdly Reformed Adventist as well.
Reformed Adventist. What's that mean?
Yes. Basically, there's this denomination that grew out of Adventism. Most of the time, they've been trying to convert current Adventists into theirs because
Mm.
they think that we're kind of an apostate church because we've strayed away from the Bible and such.
And for reference, I'm sure that it's probably clear to everybody listening, but different churches are different. So I imagine that you two's experience is going to be different from each other.
Definitely, I found it was very fascinating to go from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States and see how different the Adventist culture was.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we will get a chance to touch on it and see what the differences are. So why don't we just jump into it? We've got the BITE model here. It's an acronym, stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And we'll just go through each point under each category, and I'll ask each of you what your thoughts are for each point. So we'll just start under behavior control. The first point here is promote dependence and obedience. To what extent? This is to Andrea and Time Swift. To what extent do you think your church promoted dependence and obedience?
I would say that they definitely did that. Not so much dependence, but obedience. For example, like if you wanted to maintain your membership, you had to tithe.
Okay. 10%?
Yeah. You were expected to also give offerings, but tithing was the thing that they checked up on, and they would let that slide a little bit, but if you wanted to hold a church office, that was definitely something that you had to be doing regularly. I had an aunt who confessed to an extramarital relationship.
Uh-oh.
She was divorced and then was sleeping with her boyfriend, and the church censured her for that. There's definitely that sort of thing going on.
So she had been divorced and she had a boyfriend. So that means that she was not cheating on anybody, right? She was just basically in a relationship but wasn't married. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. I'm tempted to ask what a censure is, but we'll get to it. Give me 1 minute. I just want to get
Okay.
the Jolly Ducks take on it. What about promote dependence and obedience in your case? Do you think they did that much? I can give an example
I
if you need one.
I generally agree that there is a bit of obedience into it and not so much dependence. In our church, it was more promoted that during sermons they would promote reading the Bible. Have your own opinion on it. Don't just believe whatever the pastor told you or whoever was talking in the seminar
Okay.
or the sermon. Regarding the tithe, it was kind of lenient here in our area,
Mm.
where if you couldn't afford to give or anything like that, it was fine. You should take care of your any incoming or imminent financial problems before
Right.
actually giving tithes. It's not mandatory, but it is promoted.
That's really interesting. because I would always hear sermons about how you would give your tithe first and then God would provide.
Maybe a little bit of a
Well,
doctrinal difference. I know with, like, for example, Church of Christ, it's like super taboo to use musical instruments in worship, and for some of them it's taboo to use musical instruments at all, but others are looked down upon when they do use musical instruments in church. So it could be a regional or a church to church thing.
Yeah, it
yeah.
definitely sounds like a regional thing. That's really interesting to me.
Here in like the British area, you could divide the Adventist churches like conservative, liberal, and moderate.
Mm.
Liberal would tend to use. They didn't have any problem with any kind of music, any kind of instrument, so they would usually have different services. One would be a traditional one where it's just piano, hymns, and stuff like that. Your typical church service. Whereas there would be other services that would cater for more. Some people would say liberal, where they would have like drum kits, guitars, and stuff like that. This has sparked a bit of controversy within the church because some people don't agree with the fact that they're what we would consider not really earthly music that wouldn't be allowed in your general church.
Yeah, that was a conflict that I definitely ran into as well.
That's the first point on it. Now, the next point is actually really important. It's a really relevant one. It's modify behavior with rewards and punishments. Now, I gave an example of this with Catholicism where they have the rosary beads. If you sin, you have to confess your sins, and then they give you an assignment, quote unquote, where you have to pray the rosary a certain number of times. Or in an even more dramatic way, Jehovah's Witnesses will shun you if you disobey or disbelieve, and they will love bomb you for doing the right thing. So that's a system of rewards and punishments to kind of mold your personality into what the cult wants it to be. And the end result is almost like a glassy expression. You'll notice if you talk to certain Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever else, you'll see like glassy eyes and a perma smile on their face. Have you guys seen any kind of behavior modification with rewards and punishments in the church, setting aside the glassy eyes and the perma smile?
Well, definitely. I mentioned the censorship, and there's also a number of other punishments that are potentially laid out in the church as possibilities that the church has, including disfellowshipment, which basically means that they reject your membership. That's for like doing really bad things or rejecting core doctrines of the
Right.
church.
So what happens when you're censured? Like what do they do? What does it mean? Do they yank privileges
Okay.
from you or something? Or
Yeah, so censorship means that basically you can't do anything up front in the church. You can't play the piano, you can't do Bible readings, you can't serve in a church office, that kind
Right.
of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. I know Jehovah's Witnesses have something similar called reproval. So what's your take on it, Jolly Duck?
I don't think I think it's a bit relevant, but sometimes when there's like a business meeting for a church, right, we tend to vote on stuff at the end if it's really controversial or something like that, or it needs like unanimous decision by the church. Sometimes when the church board wants to pass something on, it's just my pure speculation. They would tend to disregard a secret ballot. So it would be like if you want to vote on something, it would be a show of hands. So for me, that was kind of it's a bit of a censorship where if you vote against the majority, it just seems like you're going to be judged by the rest of the members. That's why some of us prefer to have a secret ballot where you won't be judged because no one knows how you voted.
And I'd also like to say that there's a lot of shaming that goes on between the members to try and regulate things, especially with regards to, say, conduct on the Sabbath and things like that. It's not necessarily a top-down sort of thing. It's just sort of everybody does it to everybody else.
Right. And on that note, I don't know that the bite model really addresses specific doctrinal things like that. So this may be our only opportunity to talk about the Sabbath. I know that in a lot of Jewish communities, the Sabbath is taken very seriously. When I was in New York City recently, there's this whole Jewish neighborhood, and every building, every skyscraper in this giant Jewish neighborhood, the elevators in them all stop on every single floor on the Sabbath so that you don't have to push a button, thus basically working on that on that day. What is the Sabbath like for you? We'll start with Andrea and Time Swift. What's the Sabbath like?
Okay, so we definitely don't go to that kind of extreme, but we definitely will not work for pay or do any kind of voluntary labor, with the exception of evangelistic outreach kind of things, like sometimes go and like do a thing where we would provide food and toiletries and also tracts and whatnot to homeless people.
Oh,
Sometimes.
so you can't work for pay, but you can work as like a community service type of thing on the Sabbath then?
Yes, but it kind of has to be a church thing.
Okay. Church
Um,
sponsored.
church sponsored
Right.
and benefiting the church kind of thing.
Got it.
There were always kinds of arguments over what you could and couldn't do. Could you watch TV? What kind of TV could you watch? Could you play sports? My family, they came down on you can watch TV, but only like nature documentaries or church stuff, biblical stuff, Veggie Tales, that kind of stuff. If you were playing basketball, you could throw the ball around, but you couldn't play for like points and winning and all of that. The idea was that you weren't supposed to do anything selfish. It was all supposed to be about God. When I was talking with my pastor, I said something about how I do something on my Sabbaths, and he corrected me and made me say that it was God's Sabbaths.
What's your take on the Sabbath, the Jolly Duck?
It kind of similar to what Andrian said. Generally, yeah, we don't work on a Sabbath. If you absolutely have to, and you're like a nurse or something, they
Oh
seem
yeah, there
as
was
a rule,
there were
right?
exceptions for medical
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
because in the Bible you can see examples of Jesus healing people on the Sabbath and then getting challenged by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and such. But for that moral issue, they would usually take what they earned on that day and just tithe it or give it as an offering, so that they're not actually profiting from what they did on the Saturday.
Okay. The next one is dictate where and with whom you live. Do they do that to a large extent? What's been your experience? We'll start with the Jolly Duck this time.
The church manual has specific points on relationships and such. Generally, it discourages having relationships with people that are outside of the religion, because there can be disputes on how to raise up your children if you plan to have any. And it can lead to straying away because their behavior can influence you, and it can lead to maybe immoral stuff that you wouldn't have done if you were with someone of the same denomination.
Okay. And what's your take on it, Andrea and Time Swift?
I think they're that's pretty accurate. They don't want you cohabiting with somebody that you're not married to but are romantically involved with.
And they don't really want you kind of affiliating or hanging out with like people that are outside the religion. Is that accurate or?
It's tricky. They want you to have friends outside the religion, but not to necessarily be influenced by them. They would use the phrase "in the world, but not of it." So the idea is that ideally you're going to be converting your friends and acquaintances in the world. They don't separate you from those people completely, but they definitely put up mental blocks so that you remain separate from them and don't get led astray, as they would put it.
Yeah, there's many people in our church that did marry people outside of the denomination, but most of them have since converted sooner or later.
Yeah, my mom was that way. She married outside the church and then her husband converted.
The general principle is you should associate yourself with people that would be morally upstanding, and not someone that would cause you to deviate and become immoral and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about restricting or controlling sexuality or controlling clothing and hairstyle? Did you guys see any of that?
Church manual says that we should dress appropriately for the time period.
Okay.
So you don't have to wear like the Amish, where they wear like a dated clothing.
Very conservative clothing, yeah.
The principle is to dress modestly, not to garner any attention for yourself. Rather, that you should attract attention based on your personality and your character.
Yep, I second everything he just said. That's about accurate as far as clothing and hairstyles. Yeah.
Sexuality wise, we don't necessarily promote the LGBT community. We don't disassociate ourselves with them. We can be friends with them, but the problem is that we cannot condone their practices.
Okay. So I guess there's you can't be a full member of the church if you're gay, for example. Is that right?
You can be a member of the church if you're gay. It's just that you cannot marry anyone that's of the same sex.
Got you. And you can't have
as long as
premarital sex, right?
Yeah.
no,
So you
we see it
can.
as it's a sanctified thing given by God just to have children, stuff like that.
Got you. So if you're gay, then you can be a member of the church, but you can't. Basically, you can't be gay. You can't marry, and you can't have a relationship with somebody and also be a member of the church. Is that fair to say, do you think?
You can still attend the church. It's just that you can't be a member if
Got
you
you.
do take part in
Yeah.
those unions.
Okay, and what about just general restriction or controlling of sexuality? Like you can't, from my understanding thus far, you can't have premarital sex, for example. Are there any restrictions on like positions or things that you're not allowed to do, even between straight couples?
Nothing that I know of. I never heard anything like that. When I was there, masturbation was kind of an uncertain thing, but I think most people came
Uh,
down against it.
I read something on this. I'm not so sure. Don't quote me on this, but I read somewhere about one of our founders, Ellen G. White, was talking
Mhm.
about it. What she said was, you can do masturbation as long as you don't lust or like have
Interesting.
those immoral thoughts while doing it.
Okay, that's
That
really
brings up the-
fascinating. And I just want to make note that the Bible never mentions doing that one single time. There's this verse that's quoted that isn't actually even in the Bible. I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean the closest thing to masturbation that we do get was with Onan, but that's even that is not even pulling out is not. The sin was that he refused to fulfill his duty and give his brother's wife a son and continue his brother's line by that.
Right.
It wasn't about the pulling out
Right. Oh, do you remember which
thing.
verse that is, by the way, or which?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I know it's somewhere in Genesis.
There was one prominent person that was in our church, but was long since disfellowed in the 1900s. Was a guy called John Harvey Kellogg?
Yeah, he's the guy that
Wade Kellogg.
that popularized circumcision. Yeah, he
Yeah.
was an Adventist.
Was he really?
was, but
Yeah,
he
and
was disfellowed.
Yep.
Do they regulate what and how much you eat and drink? Now, I understand that there are some rules that go along with what you can eat, right? There's like you can't eat
Yes.
certain types of
Yes.
meat. What are those rules? We'll start with Andrian again.
Okay, we follow basically what's written in Leviticus 11. So the hard restrictions are that if you eat meat, it has to be something that has a cloven hoof and choose cud, or if it's a mammal, fish have to have fins and scales. No predatory birds, basically, though that kind of thing.
So it's pretty much
Vegeta-
kosher then, for the most part.
Yeah, vegetarianism is encouraged but not required.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure that in general alcohol is not permitted. Caffeine is discouraged in some parts but not banned. There are always conservative people complaining that caffeinated beverages are served on Adventist colleges, that kind of thing.
Okay, so what about you, Duck? Do you have any input on this one?
Well, yes. What he said, everything he said was correct. But just to add on top of that, for the Adventists, we don't just practice this because God said to do it. It's because he had a reason for it. That was what food that he permitted us to eat is what he was intending us to. He had some reason to do it.
Yeah, it's for a health reason.
Originally, during the Garden of Eden, we were supposed to eat vegetables, fruits, and that kind of
Right.
thing. The only reason why we were permitted to eat certain meats is during the time of Noah, because there was a lack of vegetation. So some people that are really extremist within the denomination or have moved on to Reformed Adventism, they see this as a reason to go back to vegetarianism because there's a lot of vegetation and such.
Okay.
So we don't need any animals at this point. The founder, Ellen G. White, also made a book about it. She was recommending a vegetarian diet.
We have the next one here, which is deprive you of 7 to 9 hours of sleep. I don't really see that a lot. Do they do that, or
No, I don't think.
Nah.
Well,
do they overwork you, or like do you have to study things nonstop or anything like that?
not overwork, but there are some programs for kids that require intense study. Have you heard of Pathfinders? It's basically an Adventist alternative.
I have not heard of that before. No.
Yeah, I've been there. I mean, generally Adventists are very health conscious and would encourage getting plenty of sleep
Okay.
at night, except in certain circumstances where like you're holding a vigil,
Sure.
or something like that.
So that's not too much of an issue then.
So basically, what we're taught is that God wants us to take care of our physical health as well as our mental health.
Mm.
So eating healthy is part of what we believe.
What about exploiting you financially? Like you guys said you can't be full members unless you tithe, right?
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Maybe I
I mean,
misunderstood.
that was definitely the case in mine. I think that that's sort of the official position, but not
Mm.
everybody. It's a regional thing. Not everybody follows that.
Gotcha.
In my church, they were pretty strict about that, but that's not everywhere.
Okay. And it's like it's
I know that
10% flat basically, right?
10% plus offerings above that.
Mm.
But yeah, tithe means 1/10. So
Got you.
they let me see. I do remember there was one time when our conference or something sent out a request for some kind of humanitarian aid, and they kind of guilt tripped the church with the line from Jesus, "What you've done to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me." While showing pictures of the poor
Yeah.
and that kind of thing.
What was that?
So
Like it was a video or
yeah, it was a video that they distributed to all the
Mm.
churches and said that they wanted us to show it.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that they were so centralized that I guess like even Methodists are centralized with like the Methodist General Conference. I forget what it's called exactly, but we will get to that because that's very interesting. What about restricting leisure time and activities? For example, are you allowed to watch like R-rated movies or do they restrict that or other things? Are you allowed to read
I
Harry Potter or whatever?
The general consensus is that you should only consume literature and media that would enhance your character or to improve certain things like education. They would promote education heavily, but they would discourage watching like R-rated movies,
Mm.
anything that would be an affront to God, basically.
Yeah, and this is actually something that's sort of a point of contention in the church. There are some bits in Ellen White where she says not to go to the theater, and so there are conflicts about whether or not Adventists can go to the theater.
Mm.
And then, of course, that now that there are movies and things didn't exist, does that mean that we can watch movies? And what kind of movies can we watch? That sort of thing. It's sort of a very contentious question in the church. Definitely, leisure activities are limited during Sabbath, as I mentioned before, and yeah, as he said, generally the rule is that you're supposed to be trying to consume media that's going to
Glorify
edify
God,
you.
quote unquote.
Yeah,
Okay.
in my church they definitely banned Harry Potter. My mother was uncomfortable with me reading Lord of the Rings.
Mm.
um, but that sort of thing. But at the same time, we definitely did watch certain R-rated movies that didn't
Right.
have like a lot of sex scenes in them and that sort of thing. So,
Take that for
yeah,
what you will then.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, that makes sense. What about this is the very last one for behavior control. What about require you to seek permission for major decisions? For example, Catholics will require you to like sign contracts and things like that for marriage. Do you see any of that?
I can't
Well,
think of anything.
there's just general marriage counseling, but I don't think that's anything to do with this.
What about like
Yeah,
confession? Do they have any kind of confession type
Um,
of thing or
Confession, it's supposed to be private within your own
mhm.
room. You shouldn't tell anyone because they're not in a position to forgive you or to
judge
uh,
basically?
judge or
Yeah,
anything like
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, they actually think that confession is one of the things that Catholics are getting wrong.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, that's the end of behavior control. Let's move on to information control. The first one under information control is deliberately withhold and distort information. With Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, they discourage you from like reading outside sources and they want you to get all of your information through them pretty much. Do you see any of that or do they ever twist information about the church or anything?
There's definitely a protection of Ellen White. There are accusations that some of her work is plagiarized,
Mm.
and they will flatly deny that. I even had a pastor say, "Don't go and read up on this kind of thing because it's led Adventists astray." He explained why the accusations are wrong, but he said, "Don't go look into it for yourself."
Mm.
But that's like the most extreme thing that I can think of.
Mm.
They are young Earth creationists, or at least a lot of them are, and so anything to do with evolution is going to be distorted and warped if you've seen Ken Ham or
Kent
Eric
Hovind or
Hovind,
anything, yeah.
that kind of stuff, it's going to be very similar to that sort of stuff.
Okay, interesting. What's your take on it, Jolly Duck?
Well, in regards to just biblical information, it's heavily encouraged for personal study. But in terms of Ellen G. White, I haven't read up on her all that much, and I haven't really taken into these plagiarism controversies, so I'm not really that well versed on her literature. In terms of evolution, yes, there's a lot of us that are really conservative that I talk to a lot of members, and then they would just like simply disregard evolution and such. They would just say it's the work of the devil. And
Well, the next point we have here is forbid you from speaking with ex-members and critics. Do they discourage you from talking to ex-members and things, or is that not really a big issue? Or
for me, it's not really much of a big issue. When someone leaves the church, instead of like in my case, instead of rebuking them and just cut off all communication with them, we're encouraged to try and spend some time with them, see what happened in their lives, and try to comfort them. And if they can, if they're willing, try to get them back into the church.
Okay, right.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. My church, every time that I show up to any kind of social function where they're there, they're always happy to see me.
Okay.
There's definitely sort of a family-like element to the church, and everybody's sad when somebody leaves, unless they were really causing trouble.
Right.
And they, and like you said, they do want to try and win you back.
Okay.
So.
The next one is discourage access to non-cult sources of information. This kind of ties in with the other one a little bit. Do they have like a website where you can learn all about like evolution and things like that, or?
They have a lot of stuff like that. I don't know necessarily any particular website. There are lots of Adventist resources. There's the Review and Herald, which I think they still own.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, which is a publishing company. There's also Pacific Press, which I don't think they own, but is also Adventist owned, just not by the church. Okay, so they have lots, so they put out lots of books and information and things.
Right.
I'm a little bit out of touch, so I don't know if they have like websites, but I know that there were tracts that would say, for information on creation evolution, see this website, or for questions about the Bible, see this website, and things like that.
Got it. What about divide information into insider versus outsider doctrine? Do you see any of that, like them saying that the other is wrong, they're wrong about this thing and that thing, and if you don't believe our way, then you're going to hell, or anything like that?
Well, I wouldn't take it that extreme where you're gonna go to hell. It's just we compare our own doctrine to compare to other denominations and see where they are wrong. So basically, we're trying to take scripture and trying to disprove their doctrine. Especially, this is heavily done with the Sabbath.
There's also a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church in particular, but yeah, that's about right. Is that we definitely dispute with other denominations over correct interpretations of the Bible, and especially about the Sabbath.
Interesting. Okay. This next one is generate and use propaganda extensively. I know Jehovah's Witnesses, I gave them a really high grade for this one because they are a printing company. That's what they started out as and what they are now. That's not limited to print, though. It can also be in the form of videos or whatever else. Do you guys see any of that from the church?
There's definitely a lot of Adventist-oriented media. It's like a whole different world as far as the media is concerned.
Really?
They have TV stations that show up on satellite and public. There's publishing companies. There's organizations like Amazing Facts that put out seminars and things like that. But I definitely wouldn't say that they have the same kind of emphasis on consuming that stuff that Jehovah's Witnesses do.
Okay, so they have like their own networks and things. But what about, like, for example, news? Do they have their own like news style networks and things?
Yeah, we have one called the Adventist News Network, or ANN for short.
Oh, okay. I hadn't heard about that one. That one must be new.
It's a weekly thing where they usually upload on Friday and talk about stuff happening in different unions and conferences within the denomination.
That's fascinating.
They usually upload on Fridays.
I think that would tie into discourage access to non-cult sources of information a little bit, but really interesting. Okay. So what about use information gained in confession sessions against you? Now, I know you guys mentioned that they don't really believe in confession at all, but is there ever a time when, I don't know, you admit to something like that they would view as wrong, like maybe you have a boyfriend and you're sleeping with him or something like that, or maybe you admit to being gay or something. Do they ever use that stuff against you?
Well, I mentioned with my aunt, that's definitely something that happened with her. If you hold an office, for example, and you reveal that you are currently engaging in a behavior that is not permitted for that office. For example, if you're a pastor and you get divorced or you're in adultery, that could make you eligible for having your ordination removed or suspended.
And so it's like there you will face repercussions for doing things wrong, pretty much. Ties in a lot with the modifying behavior with rewards and punishments, I guess, right?
Yeah. And again, the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more scrutiny is put on you for that kind of thing. And they use certain passages in the New Testament to determine, what can a deacon do, what can a
Right.
pastor do, that kind of thing.
So use of loaded language and cliches to stop complex thought. That is, I've heard some pretty solid examples of that from yours, Andrian. What about inducing hypnotic or trance states to indoctrinate? I see a lot of that from, for example, Pentecostals, where they're completely out of their minds when they're at church and singing and chanting and yelling. Do you guys have any of that or anything like it?
Honestly, I would say that that's discouraged.
Okay.
Yeah.
They talk about not repeating things vainly, no vain repetitions. They're definitely not the sort to roll around in the aisles and speak in tongues. Speaking in tongues is a very specific thing for them. It doesn't mean speaking gibberish.
Right.
It means when you speak, people in different languages can understand what you're saying, even though you're not speaking that language.
Gotcha.
For
You know,
for the purpose of mission. Yeah, so I agree
yeah,
with what he says.
yeah.
Okay, so that one's not terribly intense. What about teaching thought-stopping techniques to prevent critical thoughts? Do you see anything like that?
General theology, that doesn't happen, but in terms of like scientific, kind of.
Yeah, I would say that that's pretty accurate. I would say that there's certain maybe thought-stopping techniques for protecting you against wrong doctrine. Like you are encouraged to study the Bible, but there are certain things that are considered to be so clear-cut that, like, if somebody says that worshiping on Sunday, for example, is biblical, that you shut down on that. There's no listening to that kind of thing
Right.
except to debate it.
Okay, interesting. Is debate discouraged at all?
No.
Yeah.
I would say debate within the church is a tricky subject. Debate with people outside the church is encouraged.
Okay. What about allowing only positive thoughts? Do they heavily discourage negative thinking in any way?
In terms of negative feelings, we are allowed to have negative thoughts or so, but we shouldn't like dwell on it.
Okay.
Since we are supposed to take care of our physical,
And the
dwelling
mental
on
health.
negative
Yeah.
thoughts can lead to like mental illness. So generally, if you focus too much on negative thinking, it might lead to
Depression or
Depression.
Depression and
mental
stuff like that.
problems, right? Okay, that makes sense. What about use of excessive meditation, singing, prayer, and chanting to block thoughts? You guys said that's not really a huge issue with it, right?
No, not really.
No,
But
I don't think so. I mean, there is singing, there is praying, not so much chanting, but I don't think that it's used to stop thoughts. It's more of just getting you into a devotional mood for church or sort of as a group building exercise. You're all singing together and feeling the Spirit of God and all that kind of thing.
in more liberal churches, what I have seen in services, they tend to usually repeat courses to like worship songs and stuff like that. That would be seen as repetition in different churches. that are
Yeah,
more-
okay,
tend to be more
that's
conservative.
fair. Sometimes there'll be a chorus that they'll sing over and over again. That you're right there.
Generally, for me, it's a bit too repetitive, and I'm not really a fan of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I hated that. It was boring.
What about rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, and doubt? I think that we've talked about, for example, evolution and their rejection of that. Do you see any rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, and doubt in the church?
I'll let Duck take this one first.
In science, I guess so, but in terms of biblical interpretation, we don't we don't just use the Bible. We just don't read the verse
Mm.
and just interpret it from that. We take a number of factors. We take the whole chapter into consideration, the context, the time period, archaeological information and evidence, and so forth.
Yeah, I would say that there's certain information that's definitely withheld from members in general about like how the Bible is compiled. The story that's usually given to the general audience is very watered down and very like raise your doubts and then quickly assuage them without really going into like when I went to study religion at college, I learned a whole lot about the Bible that I didn't know before. And it was definitely something that I was told like that the scholars, they had a bias against the Bible or against
Right.
Christianity, things like that. The same thing goes with evolution, and certain doubts are definitely. It's all right to have them, but not to dwell on them.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Like if you're starting to doubt whether or not God exists, for example, that's the sort of thing where you're given a bunch of apologetics stuff to read, and then you're expected to figure to have figured it out and accept sort of the orthodox answer. So
Right. That makes sense.
that
Okay.
that was at least my experience. Yeah,
There
go ahead.
is an Adventist commentary on the Bible. They don't take everything into. They don't take every single source or approach, but they do take a lot of sources into consideration, and they do mention them in the commentary.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like the general members will be ignorant of it, but if you really study into it, then they'll tell you more of the stuff. And it's not like I don't feel like it's necessarily that they're withholding it directly as much as they're just trying to keep it simple and digestible for people who are non-intellectuals. But I think that they oversimplify and they kind of obfuscate certain things in that.
Right. Okay.
You know?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's actually the end of thought control. The next category is emotional control. So the first one we have here is instill irrational fears or phobias of questioning or leaving the group. And I see a clear example of that with, say, Catholicism, where it's just this overwhelming fear of going to hell. Do you see any examples, maybe not going to hell as the fear, but are there fears or phobias of leaving the group for any reason?
I definitely had them. Myself. Leaving the church was a very scary thing. They don't preach the fire and brimstone kind of stuff very much, but it's definitely there.
Of course, Jehovah's Witnesses didn't believe in hell, but I still had fears of leaving the group. It just wasn't based on that. What was yours based on? Just the fear of not getting to heaven, or?
There was the fear of not getting to heaven. I was also desperately afraid for my non-Adventist and especially my non-Christian friends. Like I remember I was in Africa, I just preached a sermon on stuff. During the sermon, I broke down crying actually, saying that I don't want to have to search heaven and not find you. And at the time I was thinking of some of my friends at school and how sad it would be if I didn't get to spend eternity with them.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not so much a phobia of leaving the church exactly, but it's definitely,
there, yeah.
they talk about how this is going to get really doctrinal, but like at the end of the millennium, there's going to be this whole war where all the, I'm going to say the damned, for lack of a better word, assemble and try to attack the New Jerusalem. And the idea that I could be in that army attempting to attack my friends and my loved ones,
Right.
or vice versa, that I could be, sort of standing on the wall, seeing the people that I love now trying to destroy me. That's really a traumatic kind of thing.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from with that. On a quick side note there, I'm actually wondering, which ones get to be the ones attacking friends and stuff? Like, which people get the swords and attack the non-believers or whatever?
So the idea is that anybody that would normally end up in the Christian hell, they are resurrected as it's complicated, but the basic idea, anybody who doesn't get into heaven is going to be in that army, led and deceived by Satan into trying to break into the New Jerusalem, as they say, which is the city that comes down from heaven and is going to be on earth. And at that point, then the fire and brimstone rains down, burning and killing everybody. that isn't in the city.
That's very interesting because Jehovah's Witnesses have some interesting beliefs regarding that too, and it sounds like they're really, really similar. They say only 144,000 people will get into heaven, and as soon as Armageddon starts, they're going to be given swords and sent out to kill all the non-believers, pretty much. But the rest won't.
It's definitely not. It's definitely not the Adventists and the saved who are going to be pulling out the swords. It's Satan and those who follow him.
Oh, yeah, I see. Okay, so Satan's people are going to be attacking Adventists?
The idea is, well, this is all like, oh boy. So there's basically two resurrections for the dead. The first one is for the good people who go up to heaven for 1,000 years, and then they come down in the New Jerusalem. The second is for all the bad people who are resurrected when the New Jerusalem comes down, and Satan, who's been alive and stewing on the earth, thinks, okay, this is my one last chance to rebel against God and take over the city and all of that. And so he leads everybody as an army to attack the city.
I see. The thing I find most fascinating about this is the fact that this is all written down in a book, and it's almost like it's set up at like inevitable. This is what's going to happen. But Satan presumably read the book, right? I don't know why he's following the script here. Kind of strange to me. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think the idea is that it's basically his only hope. He knows he's going to be destroyed if he does, and so he might as well go down fighting, kind of a thing.
Right.
I think that's the idea.
Oh, that makes sense.
It was something that didn't fully make sense to me either, but that's basically the idea that I get.
Right.
And Duck, you can correct me if I made any mistakes there.
Does that sound right to you,
been a while.
Duck, on that front?
I think you summed it up.
Okay.
But
yeah.
Just a little footnote: we don't believe the 144,000. There's gonna be more people than that because we didn't take that verse literally.
Right.
Yeah, the 144,000 is more treated as a
figurative, maybe
like a figurative thing. It's we're like, we don't look for specific individuals who are part of the 144,000, and honestly, Adventists don't have especially robust explanations for that particular verse. They just sort of gloss over it a little bit. But the idea is that it's symbolic for something.
Well, I feel that was pretty valuable exchange, right? I think that was really interesting.
That stuff is one of the weirdest things that Adventists believe, because it's very unlike any other denomination that I've heard of. First of all, they're annihilationists, so they don't believe that hell goes on forever, and then they believe that there's two resurrections of the dead. The dead are sleeping in the grave, and there's no afterlife until they're raised.
Well, there are reasons for why we believe that, though.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's definitely reasons for it. It's just fascinating.
That's where it goes.
So different.
Yeah, it's very different.
It's so different from other Christian theologies that makes it very interesting.
Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses have their reasons for believing the 144,000 and things too. And when you look at it just with zero context outside, it seems to make sense at its face. So I know what you mean exactly when you say there are reasons for it and everything else, but it's really interesting to get into the doctrine.
I could quote the verses for you if you really wanted to, but I don't want to make this into a Seventh-day Adventist Bible study.
No, it's fine. That's super fascinating, though. I do appreciate you getting into it. So let's look at the last few here. Do they label some emotions as sinful, worldly? I'm sorry. Do they label some emotions as evil, worldly, sinful, or wrong? Do you see any instances of that one?
Lust and hatred, and selfishness. In general, like, it's okay to like yourself, but generally you're supposed to be doing things for God and for your fellow men, and not for yourself. And there I said fellow men, which is a holdover. Adventists tend to talk in older and what we would normally think of as misogynistic language, to speaking of men and mankind and all of that.
Fascinating. Okay, what about teaching emotion-stopping techniques to prevent anger or homesickness? I know that Mormons do this when they send kids on missions, kind of cut them off from everybody else, make them dependent on the church, and they teach them how to shut down certain emotions. Do you see any examples of that in the church?
In my church, there was a discussion about this, mostly based on the emotions of anger, hatred, and such. If you... For example, if you are in a couple and you are having like a disagreement and are having like a heated argument, one of the things that were suggested was stop everything and just pray, and then it would help to alleviate some of that anger and hatred with the other partner.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that's specifically for like loneliness or homesickness, but yeah, he's right. Certain negative emotions, you're told, stop what you're doing and pray, and
Right.
that will help you get over that particular negative emotion and do the right thing.
Okay. What about promoting feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness? I know Catholics are really, really bad about this one. Do you see that a lot in Adventists?
I think it's definitely there. You're told that all our good works are as filthy rags. There's not one who's righteous, no, not one.
We all fall
you know,
short of the glory of God. Do you hear that one?
yeah, all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
And it's because of Jesus' grace that we're saved. It's not any of our own works, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Though works are also important. If you're not doing the works, that's a sign that you don't really have faith.
Right.
So
Yeah.
do the works.
A little conflict there.
We don't believe in once saved, always saved. So
Yeah. So that's also a thing where you're kind of constantly in fear of losing your salvation. If you screw up, you have to constantly be praying and seeking forgiveness and
Right.
and making sure that you're on the right path.
What about shower you with praise and attention, aka love bombing? Do you see any of that, like for new members, for example, when they're joining, or if somebody comes back after a long time or anything like that? Is that common, or?
it's a tradition most churches here where if there's like a new visitor, there would be in front before you going into the halls, there would be like a visitor's book to like you write your name, phone number, stuff like that. And once you're in with a divine service, there would be like a presider who would say, are there any new visitors here? And then people would be called out, and you would tell them your name. And afterwards, once everyone has been announced, we would have this time where everyone greets each other and says hello, and try to make it more sociable or in a happy state.
Yeah, they definitely try to welcome new people. It's a very celebratory atmosphere whenever somebody new shows up or is baptized or comes back. There's definitely that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like a malicious thing, like that it's just more that we want to make them feel welcomed and included and part of the family.
Yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't have to be malicious. A lot of the time it's not. I mean, even Jehovah's Witnesses aren't doing it from a malicious perspective, but the two next ones kind of group together. Threaten your friends and family and shun you if you disobey or disbelieve. And the reason I say that they're grouped together is because a lot of the time, Jehovah's Witnesses, they're complete pacifists. Jehovah's Witnesses are. They will not physically attack anybody or threaten people, but they will threaten them with things like shunning or negative repercussions for breaking some rule. Do you see any of that with this group, or like shunning or anything? Do they shun?
They don't generally shun. The only way that they'll leave you alone is if you tell them to.
Okay.
Or if you reject over and over and over again, and they just sort of they're just sort of like, okay, we get it.
Right.
So I don't see shunning. I don't see threatening of anybody with anything really, like your family or friends, apart from the general threat of not getting into heaven and dying in eternal death.
Standard
and all of that
stuff.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Do you have any thoughts on that, Duck, or does that sum it up pretty well for you?
It sums it up, but just want to add something. Generally, with if you have like a disobedient child, if it's like really serious or like if they won't stop, beating is kind of, not everyone does it, but like some people just quote the Bible saying like, "Don't spare the rod" or something like that.
Yeah, spare the rod, spoil the child. Yeah,
that's a pretty big saying.
Yeah, that's true. Again, it's a thing that's sort of debated among Adventists. The less conservative ones will generally be against it, and the more conservative ones tend to be for it. It's not something that you hear sermons about very often or anything like that. It's just sort of an Adventist cultural thing.
Right.
It's also kind of a traditional thing because there's like more of the African and Asian community, regardless of what like religion you are into, they will do it.
Okay. I hadn't noticed that, but yeah.
I've had my good share of that.
Okay.
So what about this very last one we have here? Teach that there's no happiness or peace outside of the group. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses say people just want to be on the outside of the group because they can sin. They want to sin. And they're really living just absolutely miserable lives. Do you guys see anything like that, or?
To some extent, I've definitely had the "you just want to sin" line thrown out at me. There's definitely things that they'll say, like, you can't be truly happy without Jesus or without a relationship with God, or,
Right.
however they say it. It's worldly pleasures are fleeting. They kind of like a drug, I
Okay.
guess, where it feels good at the time, but then it messes your life up later.
Right.
Yeah, I think they've used it, especially if you've heard about blue zones. And in California, there's like a city called Loma Linda. Generally, there Adventists have a higher lifespan than your typical Californian, and some attribute that to faith. So they would use faith as a way of like keeping positive and having something to live for, like a purpose in this life. So
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah,
so if you are constantly working towards something, that would like they would have like a more positive mindset that this is not all for nothing.
Right.
That kind of mindset.
That is super fascinating. Well, that is actually the very last point on the bite model. Before we get off of here, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you guys wanted to kind of touch on? Any closing thoughts about this or anything? I'll start with you, Andrea.
I would say that there are definitely beliefs in Adventism about demons and demonic possession as real literal beings. I would hear stories about that from various church members, usually at camp as sort of the closest thing to a ghost story that you could get. But I've also heard about it from the pulpit from pastors who say they had cast out a demon, or in mission stories where a missionary was faced with a demon possessed person, that kind of thing.
Right.
Their exorcisms are not as formal and ritualistic as Catholics. It's more of an internal struggle, I guess you could say. I don't know how to explain it, but it's definitely not a ritual thing. It's something that you deal with separately in each individual case based on what the demon is doing and what it's all about, and the personal history of the person. That they
Right.
think is demon
That's
possessed.
very interesting. Jehovah's Witnesses have similar beliefs and feelings on that. Okay. That's really interesting information. What about you, Jolly Duck? Do you have any thoughts on it? Any closing things?
Not a lot, other than Adventists in general. Their beliefs can vary from person to person. So if you're trying to define what is Adventism, it generally would not apply to every single person
Sure.
who are part of the church.
It's also really interesting how there are certain church doctrines that different churches will ignore or enforce differently, or enforce more strongly. Like there will be something that the General Conference puts out, but it's sort of a subject to interpretation kind of thing.
Right.
So the best way to learn about, in my opinion, Seventh-day Adventism is to actually go into churches and just see what it is like from the inside. They generally wouldn't withhold anything from a visitor other than like general friendliness and stuff like that. And
unless they think you're trying to cause trouble, because I know that we've had people who were using the church to try and the church phone to do drug deals and stuff like that. And so as long as you're reasonable and aren't doing something that would be unacceptable anywhere else, I think you'll be fine.
Okay.
And if you have general concerns or questions, there's usually opportunities to have that after service or during potluck and stuff like that.
Right.
Yep. Definitely want to go on a potluck day if possible, because Adventists love to share food.
Right. Very fascinating.
And if you haven't had special K roast, you have not lived.
That's interesting.
And make sure that what kind of church you're going into, because if you like meat and you bring meat to like a predominantly vegetarian or vegan church, it can be looked down upon. You'll just get weird looks from different people.
Yeah. Go vegetarian. It's always a safe option.
Very fascinating. Well, again, I appreciate you guys coming on and talking to me about this. It's been very, very interesting. And I will talk to you guys again later on, okay?
All right, awesome.
All right.